Do you know Ethan? You two know, of course you know each other. Because you just mentioned Boyle. You know, one of my students from last year had heard an interview I did with him, and he said, and he's a kid who's...
To you. Okay, so I just want to let you know.
They're unmuting us.
Okay, he's terribly... Yeah. He got an interview with Boyle. He's a disabled kid. He's got a good heart.
Oh, that.
Right in the center, okay. Hello, everybody. Good heavens. Hello, my name is Mark Danner. I want to welcome you to Northgate Hall, to our very fancy new library. Thank you for coming here tonight. Good heavens, I have the very heavy burden of introducing Michael Krasny. I say heavy burden because when one begins here, one is confronted with a choice. I could talk about his PhD in English literature from University of Wisconsin. I could talk about his 3 books. I could talk about his first area radio program, which was called Beyond the Hot Tub. Is that correct? I could talk about that. But instead, I'm going to begin by talking about zombies. The reason I'm going to talk about zombies is because in my experience, going on a book tour, promoting a book on a book tour, which is how I first got to know Michael Krasny, is a process by which writers are turned into zombies. Has anybody here done a book tour? You get a call up in your little hotel at 4:30 in the morning. You get to the airport by 5:30. You fly to the next town just in time to be met by a minder who takes you to radio stations and television stations for what are called drive time interviews. You do 1 interview, you do 2 interviews, you do 3 interviews, you do 4 interviews. By the end of the day, you've done 20 interviews. And if you're very unlucky, as I tend to be, you have a minder who talks the entire time in between. So by the end of the day, you have answered question after question after question, and your mind is destroyed. And you find out by the end of the day that it is possible to answer intricate questions about your book without thinking about it. That is, while thinking of something completely other. It's an amazing thing to learn about yourself. Why is that? Because everybody asks the same questions. Now, I've done this a number of times, and the fact is that in the United States, there are 2 oases in this desert of zombification, if I can mix my metaphors. Those 2 oases, one of them, alas, is no more. That is Studs Terkel in Chicago. That was one oasis. The other one, Michael Krasny in San Francisco, KQED Forum. Now, why is this? Well, I'm not going to try to give you an analysis of that. That's what you're here to hear. But the one thing I can say is it's not Michael's what we call encyclopedic knowledge of politics. It's not his general wit. It is something about his ability to ask questions that pierce the layer of zombification and actually connect with the writer's soul. How does he do that? How does he get you to actually talk from your heart? I have no idea. I'm hoping to find out tonight. I should tell you, because it is my duty as introducer here, that Michael was born in Cleveland. He went to Ohio University. He got a PhD, as I mentioned, in English literature from University of Wisconsin at Madison. He has been a longtime professor at University of San Francisco State. Thank you. I was going to say University of San Francisco. He has done a number of radio gigs, but the one we all know him from, he has been commanding since 1993 Forum, which itself is an astonishing thing. He's written 3 books, all of which are worth picking up, ordering and picking up off mic, which is a terrific memoir, Spiritual Envy, and his most recent, Let There Be Laughter. And what more can I say? He will be interviewed tonight by our own beloved Dean Edward Wasserman. Thank you for coming. Please greet them.
Well, Mark, thank you for that. You were supposed to introduce us, not upstage us, but But thanks, that was terrific. And I want to thank a number of people responsible for this. First, Deirdre English, whose brainstorm it was to get Michael out here for this anniversary. Let's see, our friends from KQED who are here, Holly Kernan and Ethan Lindsay. Good to see you. And I want to also acknowledge Jonathan Logan, who's unable to be here tonight, but this wonderful, sumptuous space that is completely media enabled is thanks to a very generous gift from the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation. And let me also mention Joanne Wallace, KQED's general manager, who collaborated and conspired with Deirdre to bring this about, but unfortunately has been summoned to the Emerald City of DC and can't be with us right now. And Michael, thank you for doing this.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, let me confess to being a little bit starstruck. And I'm wondering, because I listen to your show a lot, and I am as deeply admiring of it as Mark. How do you deal with being starstruck? You've been interviewing people off of the Mount Rushmore of the world of letters and politics for 25 years. Do you ever have to overcome a certain reluctance?
I mean, how do I overcome being starstruck? By being with the dean like you, or people being starstruck about me? No, it's funny. We've got a little cabal here of KQED people, and you mentioned Ethan Lindsay, who is our news manager, and Holly Kernan, who kind of runs the operation now. As I said to somebody earlier, she started out calling me her boss because she was a producer, and now she's my boss. Life can sometimes take those turns. And Dan Zoll, who's back sitting with Deirdre English, who is my right hand and left hand, and who I was saying, as I've said on many occasions, I don't think of myself as a very stellar figure. I don't think of myself as a magnet, really. I think of myself as a guy who does what I hope is a good job and takes the work seriously. And I was even thinking when I came in this evening and I saw some vacant seats, I thought, now if I were President Trump, I'd say, this is the biggest crowd that Berkeley has ever had. You know? But I'm delighted to be here, and really I'm in some ways really touched by the graciousness that you decided to do this, you being the Berkeley Journalism Department, so thank you.
So getting back to the question I asked.
So being a little circumlocuitous here, which is my wont sometimes, I don't feel, I was trying to answer it in the sense of, and I'm not trying to be faux humble, I don't think of myself as a star, I really don't.
No, I meant the people that you're getting. The list is stunning, and I didn't write it all down, but there's virtually not a single literary figure of any stature that hasn't been on your show. They come to San Francisco and part of the Commonwealth Club or City Arts and Lectures and Michael Krasny's show. So you've seen them all. Now, there have to be some of those people that you look ahead to, you're going to be sitting with, and you are just completely, what am I going to say?
A few have been that way, but you get to the point where when you interview a lot of famous people through the years, and the literary stars are the ones you've managed to certainly get pay dirt here, the ones that often excite me the most, and I did that whole book off mic, just about, a lot of it was about literary interviews that I've done, and I'm really struck sometimes by the fact that I know these people in the text, but they're different people when they come into the studio, and I have exchanges with them, and I'm their interlocutor. It's a whole different sensibility almost that can come through, and it's fascinating. That's why I wanted to write off mic, to show that kind of chasm that exists. And sometimes, of course, it's just delightful, and they're the people I imagine them to be, and maybe even more than that. But for the most part, there's a disparity between the two. I think a few of the major figures that I've interviewed have been people who had a great deal of effect on me personally as writers, and who got me really excited to talk about. And the names that come to mind are names that wouldn't surprise anybody. They were my heroes, like Saul Bellow and Philip Roth and Toni Morrison and John Updike. I mean, I've had the real privilege and good fortune of interviewing, like you suggested. I never got to Pynchon, and Ethan was disappointed in that because he did.
What was Mailer like?
Mailer is a sweetie in many ways. And that came as a surprise because he was always very combative and pugnacious, as everybody knows. And he had a kind of an incident with Terry Gross, and she kind of took him on. It wasn't like it was with some Gene Simmons or anything like that. Some of you know that story. But she did take him on, and the sexist stuff, she was coming on pretty strong with him. But he was always very, almost courtly with me, for lack of a better word. He was always very polite to a fault and quite kind. I liked him, and I did about 4 or 5 interviews with him and really enjoyed it when I had him in the studio.
So let me ask you a question that came up when Mark and I were talking the other day when he agreed to do the introduction. He said, how does he do it? And I think that may be the most compelling question I have. You are a full professor of English. You have students, you have courses, you have grades and exams and probably thesis candidates that you have to supervise. And yet you're on the air 2 hours a day and doing interviews. Now, I was a journalist for many years. I know something about interviewing, but I don't know about interviewing with other people listening in, right? But you're doing interviews, and these are not exactly people suddenly, momentarily in the news. These are very, very learned, smart, accomplished people.
I don't want to correct you, but sometimes there are people who are very much in the news.
Okay.
I mean, it's a mix, yeah.
But I'm not trying to disparage the show, but I'm saying that for the most part, I've got your books here. I've got these 3 books here because I wanted the professor to know that I'd done my homework, right? But how do you do this? What is a day in the life of Michael Krasny? What are you doing all day?
When I'm asked that question, my quick Kafkaesque response is the question now is why, maybe more than how. But I have an extraordinary wife who is brilliant and a great support system for me, and I'm driven. I think that's the easiest way to answer it. I mean, a lot of people have jobs and they hate their jobs, and they have one job that they do their whole life and are unsatisfied or disgruntled about it. I love teaching, I love broadcast journalism, and I love writing. So how fortunate can you be to have 3 things that you really feel passionate about? And I'm not good at that many other things, so it kind of works really well.
Well, how many hours does it take? Do you have production help? Do you have somebody who reads things for you and gives you synopses, or you do it all yourself?
Well, I mentioned Dan, who is a senior editor, who I gladly passed that mantle on to, and who has acquitted himself with brilliance. I use that word brilliant very sparingly, but I can use it about my wife and my senior editor, and Dan is now my senior editor. We have 2 full-time producers. We have what is called an engagement producer, which is someone who handles social media. And we have people who kind of fill in on occasion and everything. And I feel like a black hole. They feed me. And like you, I do my homework. And it's, to some extent, the only formula I know. I come in and try to be as prepared as I possibly can. And
so a given show, how many hours of prep time?
Depends on the show. If I've got a novelist on, I'm reading the novel through a couple weeks in advance and on the weekends and so forth. And I try to read books of authors that I have, whether fiction or nonfiction. Sometimes, like this morning, we did something, we did a couple of half-hour segments that had to do with news stories. One was the oil drilling that's going to be going on with Trump's new proposal, and the other half hour was about these injection sites. And I just read everything I can, and there used to be a rule of thumb, maybe a couple hours prepping. But if you're keeping up with the news all the time, and you're constantly on top of the news, and you're a news junkie, you don't have to necessarily supplement it that much. And then I had an hour with an NPR writer and woman who's in charge of, she actually wrote a book on screens. She's in charge of working with digital media, but in the capacity of especially trying to help parents understand how they can help their children in this age that's changing all their neural pathways. So I spent a good deal of time not only reading her book, but reading things that she had written. And it's 4 or 5 hours as a crow flies, something like that.
So what happens, ordinary mortals, when they're full professors of English at a university, are devoting full time to that. Now, there's only so many hours in the day. What do you do about your students?
I've been teaching part-time for a number of years. And unlike many of the Berkeley dons who consider 2 classes a full-time load.
I've met these people.
No aspersions. But it used to be, when I started at San Francisco State back in the primordial phase of my life, we were teaching a 4-course load. I mean, it seems almost hard to believe, and it was really onerous and crazy. And I reduced it to a couple of classes. And since I've been in broadcast journalism, I've been teaching a couple of classes until I took what's called an early retirement. And then I had the opportunity to teach 1 semester, 1 or 2 classes, which is what I've been doing for the last couple of years. And it fits quite well, because the truth of the matter is I used to need a lot less sleep. And now that I'm kind of longer in the tooth and older, I need a lot more sleep. I mean, I used to burn the midnight oils and stay up into the wee hours. And if I didn't have a book finished, I'd be up. My wife can attest 2, 3 o'clock, and I can't do it anymore. Just not capable of doing it anymore. So I've had to rejigger things, so to speak.
Let me take you back and ask you to tell us a bit about this interesting trajectory of your career. You started as somebody who was clearly passionate about novels, about the world of letters. You wanted to be a novelist. You described yourself in various interviews as a failed novelist. And yet you went from the permanence of print to the spoken word. And you went from fiction to a sort of dedication to a form of discourse. This is not, I would have thought that the logical next step from novel writing might have been something prosaic like journalism. And yet you didn't stop there. You went, we'll talk about that.
Well, I did do some journalism. I was writing for the old San Francisco Examiner and putting columns into different magazines that would accept me back in the day and everything. So I always had a taste for journalism. But what I learned was, and I don't mean this to be glib, I wanted to be a novelist and was very ardent about that. And I discovered not only that I didn't really have the chops, I mean, I may have had the literary chops, but I didn't have the imagination or whatever is required to really create a universe like novelists do. I also wasn't that good a liar, I mean, and I don't mean this to be crude or anything. Fiction writers have great imaginations. The greatest fiction writers have the greatest imaginations. And I found that I was really much more of a scholar and a critic and a journalist dealing with facts and dealing with, I suppose, what you could call authenticity rather than more the life of the mind than the life of the imagination, or the welding of those two. And I also found that I had a certain facility with being verbal and liked putting things into sort of oral communication or however else you want to describe it, and that it was in some ways much easier and more fun. Leslie was, she's here, she has the wounds of being an editor of a lot of my work that is now in print, and the best editor I've had, I must say. So the reality is that I found I could do much better on the fly. And there's something about doing a program without pre-recording it, and it's challenging, because you have no net. You can't edit it, you can't splice it, you just have to go with it in an impromptu and totally improvisational way. And it's like jazz in that sense.
So you're not scripted. You must have questions you write beforehand?
Yeah, it depends on who the guest is and what the topic is and so forth. But I like to come in with a kind of a map. Dan feeds me a lot, and so do my producers when I'm on the air. And thank heavens for that, because they're often covering or reminding me, prompting me about things that are, I can't be ubiquitous at one time. But there's a general kind of course of action that I have in mind, and a lot of it depends on the rapport. And I mean, we're having a conversation here, and you're kind of responding to things I'm saying. I'm responding to things you're saying. It's what good conversation ought to be, and it's what I try to do every morning in a way that's informed and in a way that's certainly educational and enlightening. The original mission of public broadcasting was education. It was an educational medium, and it still in many ways suits me as an educator to be in that medium.
I think one of the things that's so rewarding about listening to your show is why there's an emergent quality of the conversation that I think you've identified. And I find very frustrating public radio oftentimes, because you're listening to an interview by a reporter who clearly isn't listening to the answers that he or she is eliciting, and instead is going to the next question on the list of questions that have been asked. So the person being interviewed could say the most ridiculous or outrageous or provocative thing, and it's as if nothing happened. It's just not picked up. Yeah. And I don't know how you train people to do what you're doing, which can result in a much more rewarding kind of news and news-rich exchange. I don't know if you find...
You've actually identified something that has, through the years as a broadcast journalist, disturbed me, because a lot of people want to get on the show because a lot of books are sold on our show. I mean, we have the biggest listening audience of any public radio show. That's not bragging, it's just a fact. Or maybe slightly bragging. But the reality is, people really earnestly want to get on the show, and the publicists want to get them on, and they'll send a list to us, to the producers of it. Here are the questions you can ask, and you can ask them in this order and everything. And it makes me laugh, because who wants to hold that kind of conversation, first of all? I mean, if it's going to be live and it's going to be rich and so forth, you're not following that kind of a question after question and what's the next question. Plus, when people say to me, and I hope we have some aspiring journalists here, because journalism is still a very high, in my judgment, regarded and should be a noble thing to pursue. People say, well, how do you, conduct conversations, and what kind of skills or tools, what's in your toolkit and everything? A lot of it is listening, and a lot of it is really listening. Hemingway once said, most people don't listen, and I think he may have had something there. So you try to listen as best you can, with your curiosity working for you. And your curiosity, in my case, my curiosity, I come very well prepared. I don't make any bones about that. But I also come in with the thought that I'm going to let my curiosity to some extent follow. And sometimes, it can lead to sand traps and things like that. I use a golf metaphor. But sometimes it can be very rewarding, because the unexpected happens.
You say in your book, there's an interesting passage when you say you're not sure when it was you began to see yourself as an interviewer. So what was going on at that point, and who were you observing? Who were you impressed with? Who did you hear and say, that's it, that's what I want to do?
Well, it was a strange kind of gestation, because I just recently had Dick Cavett on, and Dick Cavett is, maybe younger people don't know, was a TV and for many years in different broadcast programs, including public TV. And he was considered, kind of an armchair intellectual, and, very at ease with stars, and especially movie stars and people, Hollywood people, but also writers. And I looked at an old YouTube where he was talking to, in fact, John Cheever and John Updike at the same time. And I admired his skills, and I didn't realize I was absorbing, and I was watching, and I was thinking, it's really interesting the way he conducts things. And I remember, we were talking about Bill Buckley earlier. I remember watching Bill Buckley, and despite the fact that I thought he could be terribly amorphous and, almost sometimes inscrutable, I liked the way he conducted interviews, and I liked the intellect and the heft of the intellect that he brought to the interview. So I was kind of forming, without even realizing I was forming with these kinds of things. But I never thought of myself as an interviewer, because I thought I was going to be a writer. I was going to, write the next great American novel or whatever. But these things were ingested, they were absorbed, and they were working in me. And ultimately, it just kind of happened by accident in a way. This is one of the first things I write about in my book, Off Mic, which is a memoir, and also about a lot of the literary figures I interviewed, beginning with Gore Vidal, which was what I call a baptism of fire, because he was drunk and anti-Semitic. Other than that, it was a wonderful interview.
Was he your first interview?
He was my first interview. What happened was, and you would have thought it would have turned me off for a lifetime, but actually I thought we would be pals, because we had, similar. I was kind of a lefty, came from that tradition, protesting the war and in favor of civil rights and all the rest of that. And he was pretty far to the left. He was a literary guy and so forth. I like Bill Buckley, I'm sad to say, in the movie and in person a lot more than I like Gore Vidal, because he was much more personable and less snobby and nasty. And I actually set a kind of design for myself to prove 20 years later, after that first interview, that I could be totally professional with Vidal. And it's kind of a funny story, because Vidal came in, and I reminded him, I was kind of cool, but I said, we had an interview 20 years ago on television. And he said, oh, and I could tell he had no memory of it. And I said, it was when you wrote your novel, Kalki, and he was pushing a new novel. And we talked a little bit about this, and I thought, I just want to prove to myself I can conduct a professional interview despite my enmity for this man. And we go on the air, and he said, oh, Michael, it's delightful to be back with you again when we were on television 20 years ago. So, yeah, that was a difficult interview, but it came about by a sheer kind of caprice. There was a guy named Frank Moakley, and if anybody hails from New England or Massachusetts, you may remember a congressman named Moakley. This is his brother, who was a pal of mine, head of the AV department at San Francisco State. And he said, Krasny, he said, I think, you're a literary guy. I think you might like to do an interview. We're going to do a little series with some writers with PBS, with the local KQED. This is before I went into commercial radio because I was with ABC for a number of years. But I thought, oh, lead me to it. And that was kind of a quicksand moment for me in some ways, a quickening of my own blood, I suppose, with the thought that I think I can do this. And I did it. And as tough as it was with Vidal, I had a taste for it, and I realized. And Mark Danner remembered that I had this radio show on KTIM, what he used to call alternative radio in Marin County, called, indeed it was a name that I sometimes regret and wince when I think of it. It was called Beyond the Hot Tub, because I wanted to show that there were some really pretty extraordinary people in Marin County, people who were doing good public service.
Beyond the hot tub?
Beyond the hot tub.
This is a comment on the idea that people think Marin is so shallow. Is it a reference to Marin? What?
Well, it's very quick thinking on your part. Yes.
No, I just,
Well, here, let me give you a little background. There was a TV show called.
I mean, I did watch Hot Tub Time Machine, both versions of it.
Well, I missed those.
So I feel.
But there was a
both very-
TV
first
show
was
on
very good.
NBC called I Want It All Now, and it was a guy named, it's not important what his name was, he was a producer who came in and said, I'm going to show Marin County to the world and what life is like there. And it was all about hot tubs and peacock feathers and hedonism and materialism and just self-indulgence and luxuriating in self, narcissism. And a lot of people were mad at this guy for making that film, but you know, I was meeting some people who were really doing some amazing things, people who were running hospice and people who were, and there were a lot of famous people in Marin too, and I thought I could do radio and interview people who were really making a difference beyond the hot tub, and also, you know, some pretty stellar people and interesting people in the world of rock and film and so forth, and that was kind of how I got started in radio.
So I pulled some quotes from you about interviewing. You were quoting approvingly Jim Lehrer saying good interviewer ought to be invisible. And then you said the practitioner, you have to be a bit of a courtesan.
My words come back to haunt me.
Well,
Let me take the Lehrer thing first, because that was an important line to me. I was interviewing Jim, and he was talking about Bosnia and having interviewed somebody who was close to Milosevic, and I said, you know, I heard you in that interview, and it was very out of character for you, come in and express your disapproval of the man that you were talking to. And he said, you're absolutely right. He said, that was a bad moment for me because I don't want to do that as a journalist. I want to keep myself completely out of it, be as invisible as I can, and that's what good journalists do. Well, I've taken that to heart on many occasions because I see myself as an interviewer sometimes as, it can be stealthy, but it can sometimes be more overt than that, because I have opinions and I have views, and you know, I don't like to mix them up that much because I like to hear both sides, and I like to be as much of a journalist in the best sense as I can be. But sometimes the way you phrase a question, the way you look at somebody that you're talking to. I just saw the movie The Post, and I was really quite moved by it, not only because I was very active in protesting the war in Vietnam, and it's about Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers and all of that, but because one of the early interviews I did was with Robert McNamara, and as a Vietnam protester, it was so challenging to me to try to interview him and keep myself as the good interlocutor who just wanted to hear what he had to say and didn't. I challenged him and was tough with him, but didn't say, you realize what a war criminal you are, or something along those lines. So you have to kind of keep yourself, I have to keep myself under control, and that's why I'm fortunate enough that I kid Dan Zoll that he's my super ego, but in many ways he's, you know, I say, Michael, maybe, you know, it was a little bit there and whatnot. There are different styles, different styles of interviewing, and some interviews, I had respect for Charlie Rose, but it was always in many ways about Charlie Rose, you know, or you listen to Chris Matthews and you think, this is a guy who would interrupt the Pope, you know. And I don't mean this disrespectfully. I try to navigate, and sometimes it's very challenging, between bringing myself in, because today, like I was talking about this guest that we had on who's written a book about kids and the effects that iPads and devices and screens have on their minds and their mentality and so forth. And I realized, you know, I raised 2 kids and I have some things that must have come through and that were imbued in the questions that I was asking. Some of them obviously from her book, but some of them in my own sensibility. So it's a mix for me, and that's what it.
Yeah, but look at the people who are here tonight, the people who admire you and follow you and respect you, aren't saying that or feeling that way because you're a tabula rasa. They obviously think you're bringing a certain approach, a certain sensibility, a certain intelligence to bear. What do they think? Who do they think you are that you're not? Or how do you square? What opinions? What is the image they have of Michael Krasny that is not that you think are mistaken, or they're imbuing you with attributes you do not have?
Well, I've given away a few things. I've talked about the fact that I love poker, and some people seem surprised by that. I don't know why. You know, it's a challenging game, but I think there are associations with.
Well, might I add, you also describe yourself as a former street thug in Cleveland.
Well, that's the thing. That's a side of me that a lot of people don't know and have never seen, and I hope don't see.
How thuggish were you?
Well, I hung out with some pretty wild guys, and some of them, you know, went to jail, and some of them were bad boys by any standards of the day. I mean, I was a working class kid, and those were my buddies, and they didn't influence me that much because, you know, they did things that were sometimes really not only unlawful but outrageous and really beyond the pale. But I do take a certain modicum of pride of having come up that way and having that in my roots. I think, though, that I've become mellower as the years have gone on, but I've had, you know, problems with a temper, and I don't mind admitting it. I'm just confessional mode. Forgive me.
Have you ever lost your temper on the air?
Only once that I know of in public radio, and Ethan and Holly remember this, and so does Dan quite well. I thought the mic was off, and
Oh, man.
and things had just completely disintegrated technically, and I said the F word. And you know, it was fun. What was funny to me, I felt terrible about it because, you know, you can get fined, FCC fines, and all kinds of things. But it was almost kind of charming what happened. I mean, people were saying, "Boy, Krasny's human," and did I really hear what I thought I heard out of his mouth? You know, there was all of that kind of response, and that was really the only time I did lose my temper. But I do have a temper. I mean, I just did a show recently on road rage. Your former assistant dean colleague and I were talking about this because her son, excuse me, our mutual friend's son was on the air. He's a psychologist who works with people with road rage, believe it or not. And Marin has a big practice. And I've had to tamp myself down through the years, you know, and I've actually confessed to this on the air, so maybe people do know about it. I'll honk at somebody who cuts me off, and they'll give me the finger, and this is the boy thugging me. I want to go after them and beat them up. You know, I'm a guy who's crossed the threshold of 70. You don't do those things at this stage of your life. And I shouldn't have even thought that way, you know, 10, 15 years ago. But, you know, D.H. Lawrence talks about speaking with your blood sometimes, and you can. I'm working on another book now, and one of the things I was writing about was just these kind of primal emotions that we have. And they're so strong in us, and some of us recognize them. But people think, you know, because I have a sedate voice and tell me I have a comforting voice and all those kinds of things, which is nice to hear. I nevertheless have been struck by, some of you may have seen in this recent terrible case with Larry Nassar, you know, molesting these young women. It was just a frightful, horrible, tragic case, over 100 women, young women, trauma. And one of the fathers, who actually was the father of a couple of young women, lunged at him and said, "Just give me 5 minutes with him, you know, that's all I ask you for." And the judge said, "No, I can't do that." And so he said, "Okay," and he jumped him. And, you know, a lot of people felt bad because the deputies kept him protected. And just today there was a woman U.S. senator who said, "I'd like just 1 minute with him." That's my kind of senator, you know, not because she's a Democrat, but because she's speaking my language. And I think we understand these kind of primal emotions. Sometimes they can get out of hand, though. And I've learned, I think, I hope I've learned as I've gotten older, just not to let as many things bother me and get under my skin as much.
You have to, I would think, negotiate between this kind of tabula rasa identity and confrontation. And the confrontation can sometimes lead to the most illuminating exchanges. And I'm wondering, you're reading these people the whole time, right? You have some idea of what they're doing with everything, but can you just tell us how you do that?
I think it's absolutely open season to be confrontational with politicians. I believe very strongly in that. And if you have somebody who is taking a controversial position, and it's a position that you can almost ferret out as adversarial to what many of our listeners may feel or something like that, it almost is de rigueur to be confrontational. But there are moments where I'm tempted to do that and I withdraw somewhat, or I get maybe more stealthy about how I ask the question. It's confrontational in a way, but it's, I'm smiling. Janet Malcolm writes about, how journalists can be very, not only very sneaky, but they can sometimes lure people in.
They're cons.
Yeah, and frankly, con them and game them. Because you want to get that kind of information, you want to get at those things. When I wrote this book on Jewish humor, I found that some of the most interesting jokes in terms of analyzing them, and I know you read the book, and thank you for that. And thank you for saying that you like the jokes, but the analysis, that was one of the first.
It was a little bit of a buzzkill. I mean,
I understand. One of the first comments that came on online was, keep the jokes, leave the cannoli. I mean, all the analysis, And there was only a 2-star review. Thank heavens there were a lot of 5s after that. But I was struck by the fact that when we were having this discussion, I remember that some of the most verboten jokes were the jokes that revealed the most. And that's true, and I always have to keep that in mind on the air. So it's you don't want to outrage people, and you don't want to violate certain borders that you can cross and mess anybody up, as we used to say where I came from. But at the same time, you really have to be mindful of the fact that you want to get as much as you can out of this person that you're talking to.
So pulling the camera back a little bit, you have any observations about how the media are handling, the news media are handling Trump in terms of confrontational adversarialism? Is it excessive? Is it appropriate? It's a tremendous issue within the news business now to try to, because nobody's ever confronted what they're confronting now, with the kind of denials, the lies, everything we so are
It's kept
richly.
news people pretty busy, though.
It keeps them busy, but
busy.
do you find yourself wishing to see more spying by the media, or do you feel that perhaps it's excessive now and the media are painting themselves into an adversarial corner? I just wonder what your...
Well, I try to, I think it's part of my job, my responsibility to keep up with all different points of view. So I'll listen to and read the right and the left as much as and the center. And what's striking to me is that you can listen to MSNBC and you can hear Trump being trounced all the time, for example. You can listen to Fox now and you can hear Trump being praised or supported or given a great deal of credibility. And the gap is enormous. So you're getting really kind of two different nations almost. We are, whether we realize it or not. I just had David Frum on my show, who is now a senior editor of The Atlantic and was a conservative. In fact, he was a speechwriter for George W. Bush. But he calls himself a never Trumper now. I like these kind of guests, who will come on and be critical of Trump and yet, have real conservative credentials. And Frum said, we've got two Americas now. And in fact, George Saunders was on the other day, and the fiction writer who won this year's Man Booker Prize, and he said the same thing. He said, we got left America and right America. It's not even red and blue anymore. And there's so much of a division that when you hear, and this is just an easy example, because you can see the same thing if you read the Weekly Standard or you read The Nation. You just see this divide in America.
So does this mean the media are doing their job or aren't doing their job?
Well, it depends on where your politics are, I'm sorry to say, to a great degree.
Well, in the sense that, is the public getting the information it needs for a sovereign electorate to make the decisions charting its future? Or are you ending up with a confused, passive, bewildered public that is making foolish decisions because it doesn't have the information it needs?
I think it depends. It depends on who is listening and how serious they're listening. But I can tell you this, I think that a lot of the work that's being done by Washington Post and the New York Times particularly is exceptional. I mean, because, I mean, just this recent story that's come out today about this wife beater that was in the Trump administration, it wouldn't have come out if it hadn't been for good journalists. And here is a White House, and do I sound like I'm being critical of the White House? Well, so be it. But here's a White House, including General Kelly, who had this guy there. They had a report from the FBI. They had everything they needed to know about his abuse of women. Not only 2 wives, but a girlfriend. But he had to have a black eye, literally, which gives him a black eye, to take any kind of action. And it was journalists who exposed that story, just like it was journalists who have been on Trump exposing really things that need to come out. Is the public going to be more aggressive? Is it going to be more passive? Is it going to help Mueller? What's going to happen when Mueller comes out with a full report? I don't claim to be a soothsayer, and I can't look in the crystal ball here, but boy, I sure hope people are realizing the importance of their citizenship and also their franchise as voters.
I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'll throw it open to the audience for questions. There'll be somebody with a mic. Julie, thank you. Why don't you teach this stuff? You're a professor. You know, I'm listening to this. I'm listening to you talking, and I say, wow, this would be terrific. I've got students here that love to learn what you do. Do you do literature in the university and journalism in the studio, or have you ever married the two?
Well, they marry in curious ways because I've interviewed so many writers that I'm able to talk about interviews with these writers and experiences with them and so forth when I'm teaching. But I've had that bifurcated identity. I mean, literature in the classroom.
So you never thought of teaching interview?
I've never taught, actually, this may sound like a joke because of all the hot tubs we were talking about before, but Esalen Institute asked me if I would teach a course on interviewing a number of years ago.
With your clothes on?
That was up for grabs. I definitely look better with them on. But there was also, I did something a number of years ago for something called the Teaching Company, which is a company that provides educational DVDs and CDs, and actually I did 2 volumes for them in print. It was all about masterpieces of the short story. That was, there were 16 stories that I had to select and talk about in front of a camera. And I realized they wanted me to do a course on interviewing, and Esalen wanted me to do a course on interviewing. But you know, I interview kind of like a bat in a cave. I follow my radar and everything. And I was asked, you know, did I want to do a book on interviewing? I don't think, I don't mean this in any humble way. It's just, it hasn't compelled me. It hasn't ignited in me the desire as much as literature continues to.
It just occurs to me that you could take interviews. You don't have to sort of now do this. Yeah. You could take interviews at Ted Koppel or you know, interviewers that do it well, and play those interviews, and then play interviews that are done badly, and then say, see this, she missed the opportunity. You know, you could, in other words, you could bring the same kind of analytical skills you apply to literature to the form of interviewing.
Well, there was one wedding of that I should mention. A few years ago, McGraw-Hill came to me, and anybody know Maggie Sokolek here at Berkeley? She's in the linguistics department. They took Maggie and me to dinner, and they said, you two should do a textbook together. And we did a textbook for McGraw-Hill. She was in linguistics, and it was a good partnership because she worked with a lot of students with second language problems, and essentially we did a reader. And we had fiction, and we had essays, and we had graphic fiction, and we had poetry, and so forth. And we also had tapes of interviews that were conducted by me on KQED. And it was a textbook that was out there in the world. I guess it's still out there in the world, but it was one of these textbooks that never really took off or never got much play, unfortunately. But the tapes were there for people to learn in a way that you're suggesting.
Right.
They were mostly good interviews, though. Because, you know, when I used to teach composition, English composition, and you can teach a great deal about writing skills by showing students essays that have problems and say, this is what you don't want to do.
Yeah, forgive me, I put my dean's hat on, thinking about ways to enrich our curriculum. So questions from folks. Yes, Simon here?
Yeah. Hello. I heard a very curious comment you made, and I think it addresses a lot of the issues that have been raised when you seem to suggest that it was inappropriate to interrupt the Pope. Why? I mean, given the history of the Catholic Church, given the disclosures, isn't that something that you need to address?
I know your tongue isn't that much in cheek, so let me tell you. See, I do hear sometimes from listeners that I interrupt guests, and it's something that I'm sensitive to, because I like to think of myself as a civic, courteous, all those kinds of good virtues. So I guess the reason I think about it, I know Chris Matthews, he's a good Roman Catholic. That's his background. I'm sure he has a certain respect for the papacy and the office that you don't have. So it was in context of Chris Matthews more than it was necessarily, I might interrupt the Pope, okay? Does that make you feel better about me? All right.
Questions?
Secret to success, all these successful people you've interviewed, how did early formative childhood or early experiences, and in particular, how did ego hurt or help? How did narcissism hurt or help?
It's a splendid question and a good question. I have to ruminate on it more than maybe off the cuff here, but I'll try to give you some, I hope, light on that. Yes, you're right. I've interviewed a lot of really successful people, Nobel Prize winners, and people of great esteem. And the reality is, most of these people are driven, and sometimes a woman who was a friend of mine named Alexandra Botwin, who now recently passed away, unfortunately, who was a really wonderful psychologist, said there's a certain kind of healthy narcissism, and that always reverberated for me in some ways. There are people who are really driven, but they're driven because they want to excel. They're driven because something is ignited in them that makes them want to excel. And in many instances, they found something that they really are fortunate enough to feel passionate about. And one of my literary idols, Isaac Babel, said, "Passion rules the universe." And I think to some extent that's true. When you find people who have really succeeded to a great extent, they seem to be driven by self-esteem and narcissism to a healthy degree, because a lot of them are surprisingly humble, or they are able to put on that mask of being humble to some degree. And the reality is that they've been fortunate enough to find something that makes them feel authentic and that they can give themselves up to, that they're really good at. And that's in all fields, in every field across the board.
Have you killed your ego?
God, I hope not. No, I've had to subdue it, though. And I've had to beat it up in different times. I'm not one of these. I actually studied Buddhism pretty seriously, and I thought maybe we can check out and just drink tea and say Zen prayers and whatnot. It's not who I am, obviously. I mean, I've got too much viscera, or good Yiddish word kishkas, going in different directions at the same time sometimes. So no, and I don't want to kill my ego because I think my ego drives me. It can be sometimes something that I don't want to show to the world or maybe to myself, but it's not a bad thing necessarily.
So this is about interrupting. When I listen to you, I have a lot of empathy, because sometimes people go on and on and on, and I'm sitting there saying, "Oh, Michael, why don't you get him to shut up?" And I'm aware of what a delicate balance it is for you to, let people say what they need to say, but then cut them off at times too. So I'm very aware of that.
Well, I'm glad, because you've stated it well. It is a delicate balance, and you don't want to. I can sometimes have the kindest motives, really, and say to somebody, "Oh, excuse me, forgive me, but I have to interrupt you." And people will say, "You shouldn't have interrupted," or "You interrupted because it was a woman," or all kinds of things, or "You interrupted because it was an African American," or who the hell knows? How these people get these things in their head, I can't imagine. I'm always marveling at what people think they hear, as opposed to what I may say or what may actually occur in parlance and in exchange of ideas. So all I can tell you is I do my best to be civil and polite and courteous, like my mother trained me to be. And it's challenging sometimes. Sometimes, you know, you get callers sometimes, and not only callers, but guests who think, is this a filibuster? What do we got going here? You know, I'm not sure. So I've trained myself to just be as polite as I can be and as I had an interesting example of that just the other day. I was talking about it with Dan. We did a program on Puerto Rico, on the relief that's been going on to Puerto Rico. And we were fortunate enough to book the mayor of San Juan, who, you know, has had a kind of ongoing battle with President Trump about throwing the paper towels and whatnot. Anyway, we had John Sepulveda, who's a great, really first-rate journalist, and he was in Puerto Rico. He'd been in San Juan. He was outside of San Juan, and he was giving us this terrific report. And John has had enormous praise for. I had Dan Rather on, and John was giving a report. And Dan Rather, that guy is good, you know. And it doesn't get better than that from Dan Rather. So Sepulveda is going through the whole report, and Dan's people saying, "We got the mayor. The mayor's on, you know, Mayor San Juan and everything," and he's giving this absolutely first-rate, stellar report. And I'm thinking, I got to get the mayor on here. I said, John, excuse me, I'm sorry, I've got the mayor waiting here. I felt bad about interrupting him, and the mayor came on and said, that guy was really good. You know?
So I've got a question for you. Your guests are always celebrities, and I'm wondering whether it ever occurred to you that it might be interesting to have extraordinary people on that nobody's ever heard of.
I hate to I hate to correct you, Ed, but we do have.
I get that a lot.
No, we do have ordinary people. In fact, we had a whole series going where we just featured people. I wouldn't call any of them celebrities. They were just people who were in the Bay Area making a real impact. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things. I mean, you know, it's a splendid idea, and it's an idea that I support wholeheartedly, and so does Dan and Holly and Ethan, I'm sure. And we sometimes have programs. We had a whole outreach where we asked listeners of KQED to tell us, just listeners, what have you done in the way that would lend itself to, say, programming? What do you, and for example, we did a program on foster children. We had a lot of foster children who told us that they were in foster care, and so we had them on. We, with the fires up north, we had a lot of people who just went through, you know, the terrible experience. And so it's not all celebrities. I mean, we're lucky enough to have people come to Cal, they come to Stanford, they come to the Commonwealth Club and the World Affairs Council and so forth, and some pretty exceptional people. But believe me when I tell you, we have a lot of lay people and a lot of people who we're really delighted to have as lay.
I'm glad to stand corrected. Question? Yes. I'm sorry. You got?
Oh, I am so sorry. Me? Yeah.
It's coming your way.
So I know that you very successfully made the transition from written to spoken word. And with applications nowadays, I feel like it's a lot of get experience with, or we need an experienced written journalist. We need an experienced broadcast journalist. We need you to have this and this. How do you establish yourself as a journalist before anything else? You know, having interest in both written and spoken word.
Well, I don't know that I would be a good paradigm or example for that, because my career kind of took off in strange ways and unpredictable ways. But when people ask me that question, when students ask me that question, and though I teach literature, I get a lot of journalist students, and certainly we've had a lot of people come to the station, young people. We just had a wonderful group of young kids who came the other day. They're part of an independent school that's supported by someone I know. And the reality is you have to get some work under your belt. If it means getting something in print or getting what we call an air check, and getting behind a microphone is not the easiest you need a lot of stepping stones usually. So I'll tell students, for example, work in production, or, I mean, because there are a limited number of people who work behind the microphone, and they, alas, seem to be dwindling in numbers. So I'm not necessarily talking about doing reporting or doing journalism that's going to the scene in front of a camera, but written journalism, all of the journalism, you need a track record. Doesn't matter whether it's written or behind a microphone. So get something in print, get something behind an air check, like I said, or, you know, I'll tell people there's KPFA here in Berkeley, which is a public radio station. And it's a very small station, and it doesn't have a lot of funding. And the result is that they can sometimes have people come in and do like voluntary programs, or actually work in front of the microphone, or go out in the field and do things. Just get something on tape, or get something in a small magazine. If you have a talent, or think you do, for writing a review, or writing a story that you feel the public would like to know or would benefit by, just get it into print. Get it into the local newspaper, get it into the UC Berkeley newspaper, whatever you can do, and you can say, here's work of mine, and you can take it in. The jobs are at a premium, they're limited, and they're difficult to come by. And bear that in mind too. I tell our interns and many of the students I talk to, dream big, but work hard and establish yourself and go as far as you can go.
Got time for one more question? Yes, sir. Yep.
Thanks, Ed. You've asked, and others have, about, dealing with difficult guests or difficult, but it seems to me that one of the problems as an interviewer is, what do you do when you, or how do you make an interesting interview when you have somebody with whom you agree 100%?
It's also a very good question. Well, I like to be devil's advocate, and I do play that role, I think, fairly constantly and consistently, and I hope well. And challenging people sometimes is a really good thing to do, especially if you're completely on board with them. And so I find myself thinking, well, okay, you're saying this, and I couldn't agree more, but what about that? And what about the other? And it's always a challenge, for me at any rate, to do that, to at least see another side, or to come at it from another angle, and to get from the person things that maybe the person didn't expect from somebody who they thought would be sympathetic with them.
Well, folks, thanks very much for tonight. This is, for those of you who are watching from elsewhere, this is the University of California Graduate School of Journalism, Michael Krasny, interviewer extraordinaire from KQED Radio. I'm Ed Wasserman, Dean of the school, and thank you very much. Wonderful evening.
Thank you all. Thank you, Ed. You want to take it on the road?
This is great.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
It was a lot of fun, man.
Yeah, you too.